The ocean stretched out before them, a vast, dark abyss that seemed to hold secrets beyond comprehension. On board the research vessel Endurance, the crew bustled with an undercurrent of anxiety. The mission was clear: explore the depths of the Mariana Trench, one of the most mysterious places on Earth. Captain Sullivan stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the endless black waters ahead. "Prepare for descent," he called out, his voice steady, but a flicker of unease passed through his gaze. Dr. Emily Clark, the lead marine biologist, checked the submersible systems one last time. Her mind raced with questions, but she kept them hidden beneath her professional exterior. Below them lay the unknown, a world untouched by human hands. And as the submersible's tethered descent began, a shiver ran through the crew. No one knew what they might find in the dark ancient waters below. No one could have predicted what they would encounter. The submersible's descent continued in eerie silence. The deeper they went, the more distant the surface world seemed, until all that remained was the cold, dark ocean pressing in on them from every direction. The deep sea was alien, a place where light could never reach. Dr. Clark's voice broke the silence, her words tentative. "There's something down there," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the monitors in front of her. "Something that doesn't belong." She had read about the strange phenomena recorded in these depths, but nothing could have prepared her for what they were about to uncover. The further they descended, the more the submersible's instruments began to behave erratically, as though the very ocean was resisting their intrusion. But despite the warnings, they pressed on, driven by the lure of discovery. And then, just as the vessel reached 20,000 feet, something caught their attention, a flicker of movement in the depths. The team held their breath as the flicker of movement turned into something more. A large, shadowy figure swimming beneath the submersible. It was unlike any marine life they had studied before. Dr. Clark's heart raced as she leaned closer to the monitors. "It's massive," she said, her voice strained. "It doesn't match any known species." The crew could see nothing but the shadow below them, but it moved with a purpose. Captain Sullivan's grip on the control panel tightened. "What is it?" he asked, barely able to mask his fear. The shadow seemed to circle them, growing ever closer. The submersible's lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the dark water, and the crew could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on them. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the depths, leaving them in oppressive silence. Did anyone else see that? The question hung in the air as the crew exchanged nervous glances. Dr. Clark was the first to break the silence. "I don't know what that was, but I don't think we're alone." Captain Sullivan didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the controls, his hands now trembling slightly. The submersible descended deeper, the shadowy figure still in the back of their minds. But then, just as the crew thought they might have imagined it, a flash of light flickered in the distance. It was far too bright to be a fish, and too fast to be anything natural. "What the hell?" Sullivan muttered, his voice a mix of awe and fear. The light seemed to beckon them, drawing them further into the unknown. The crew could feel the pull, like a magnetic force, compelling them to approach. The light flickered again, now almost blinding in its intensity. It seemed to pulse, rhythmically, as if it were alive. Dr. Clark's fingers hovered over the controls. "I don't like this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to turn back." But it was too late. The submersible had already drifted toward the source of the light. The crew was mesmerized, drawn to it as if some unseen force was guiding them. And then, with a sudden jolt, the submersible systems began to malfunction. The lights flickered, and the hum of the engines sputtered. The crew's hearts raced. "Get us out of here now," Captain Sullivan shouted, but the submersible did not respond. Instead, the light grew brighter, and the temperature inside the submersible plummeted. Something was coming. The submersible groaned as it continued its descent, the temperature inside now unbearably cold. The flickering light from the mysterious source outside cast an unnatural glow inside the cabin. Dr. Clark shivered as she watched the monitor, her breath misting in the freezing air. "Something's not right," she said, rubbing her hands together. "The deeper we go, the stranger everything feels. Captain Sullivan remained silent, his eyes glued to the controls. The submersible's systems were malfunctioning more frequently now, and the sense of dread that had been building was now undeniable. The crew's unease grew with each passing moment, and the weight of the deep sea seemed to press down on them with an almost tangible force. The light grew stronger, its rhythmic pulse pulsing like a heartbeat in the darkness, as if something was alive down there, watching them. They had come for discovery, but now they were plunging into a place where no man should go. "We should turn back," Dr. Clark insisted, her voice edged with panic. "We're too deep. The pressure is getting to us, and these systems are failing." But Captain Sullivan, ever the captain, shook his head. "We came this far. We have to see it through." His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed the fear that had started to take hold of him as well. The crew knew they had crossed a line. They were venturing into a part of the ocean where even the bravest explorers feared to tread. As the submersible continued its descent, the mysterious light flickered violently, now pulsing erratically, casting strange, twisting shadows on the walls. Dr. Clark's heart raced as she observed the movements in the water, noticing something far larger moving in the distance. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But no one had an answer. No one could explain the strange, almost unnatural shapes forming in the depths. The submersible lurched suddenly, and the crew felt a violent jolt. The eerie lights outside went out completely for a brief moment, plunging them into absolute darkness. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating, until a low, distant sound began to vibrate through the hull. It was a deep hum, resonating from somewhere in the depths. "What the hell is that?" Sullivan muttered, looking around frantically. Dr. Clark was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "We need to leave, now." The air in the submersible felt heavier, almost suffocating. The pressure from the ocean depths was becoming unbearable, and the hum, the sound of something ancient and alive, was growing louder. The light from outside flickered back on, but it was no longer the soft glow they had seen before. Now, it was a harsh, blinding light, flashing in irregular bursts as if trying to warn them to stay away. But they had already ventured too deep. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound reverberated through the submersible. The crew was thrown forward, their bodies slamming into the sides of the cabin. Captain Sullivan cursed under his breath as he tried to regain control of the vessel, but it was slipping away from him. The pressure was becoming too much. "We're going to crush," Dr. Clark screamed, her voice cracking in fear. The walls of the submersible groaned as the water outside pressed against them with unrelenting force. The light outside flickered once again, but this time it seemed to shift, taking on a shape, a form that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Something was down there, something ancient. The sound of water rushing, and the submersible's frantic attempts to stabilize only heightened the fear inside the cabin. The crew realized they were no longer alone in the deep, and whatever was down there wasn't going to let them leave easily. The submersible's descent had slowed, but the danger wasn't over. The lights outside were now dimming, replaced by the strange pulsating glow of something enormous swimming nearby. The crew could hear its movement, a rhythmic shifting of water that was unlike any animal they had ever encountered. Dr. Clark, shaking, whispered, "It's like it's watching us." Sullivan's face was pale, his mind racing for a solution. "We need to get to the surface now." But the controls were frozen. The submersible was at the mercy of whatever force was down there, and the pressure from the ocean depths seemed to be building in intensity. The strange light seemed to follow them, now pulsing directly at the submersible's windows, casting long, dark shadows. Something was out there, and it wasn't friendly. As the creature circled them, the sense of dread grew, filling the submersible with a thick, suffocating tension. There was no escaping what was coming. The submersible continued its descent, the weight of the ocean pressing down on it with an oppressive force. The strange, pulsing light outside flickered in irregular bursts, casting an eerie glow on the interior. The crew was silent, each of them too afraid to speak, yet too terrified to leave the darkness they had plunged into. Dr. Clark's eyes were wide with fear as she stared at the monitor, trying to make sense of the readings. "The depth gauge is broken," she muttered, her voice strained. "We've gone past anything we've recorded before." Sullivan's grip on the controls tightened. "How deep are we?" he asked. But Dr. Clark couldn't answer. The submersible seemed to be free-falling into the abyss, pulled by some unseen force. Outside, the pulse of the light grew stronger, almost vibrating through the metal hull of the submersible. The silence between them was deafening, and the crew knew something far worse was waiting for them in the dark. Suddenly, a loud bang rang through the submersible. The lights flickered wildly, and the vessel lurched to the side. "What the hell was that?" Captain Sullivan shouted, trying to maintain control. The submersible's systems began malfunctioning, lights dimming, and the instruments going haywire. Dr. Clark gasped as a shadow passed by the porthole, massive and unnatural in shape. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. The creature outside had found them. Its movements were fluid, almost liquid in their grace, but it was monstrous, too large to comprehend. It circled them like a predator, its glowing eyes staring into the submersible, as if aware of their presence. The crew could only watch, frozen in terror, as the creature's massive form drifted past the submersible, its body blocking out the faint light from above. There was no escape. They were trapped in the depths, at the mercy of something ancient and far too powerful. The submersible's metal frame groaned as the creature's presence pressed against it. The humming sound outside grew louder, reverberating through the walls. Dr. Clark was frantically tapping at the control panel, trying to regain control of the vessel, but nothing responded. "We need to move now," she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. Captain Sullivan's hands were shaking as he tried to communicate with the surface, but the signal was dead. They were isolated, cut off from the world above. The creature outside seemed to sense their desperation. It began to circle them faster, its glowing body flashing in the dark water like an ominous beacon. The submersible shook again, more violently this time. Sullivan's voice cracked as he gave the order, "Brace for impact." The crew barely had time to react as the submersible was slammed from the side. The lights flickered once more before plunging them into darkness. Ah! Silence fell. The hum outside faded. When the submersible finally stopped shaking, a chilling stillness enveloped them. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, only the oppressive silence of the deep ocean. Dr. Clark's breath fogged up in front of her, and she wiped the condensation away with a trembling hand. "We've lost power," she said, her voice hollow. "Everything's gone dark." The submersible was dead in the water, completely still. No signals were being sent, no responses from the surface. The crew was trapped in an eternal abyss. And then, the lights flickered back on, dim at first, but slowly brightening until the strange, pulsating light from outside illuminated the interior. Something was wrong. Crew could feel it. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its eyes watching from every angle. "We can't stay here," Captain Sullivan said, his voice barely a whisper. But before they could make a move, a voice broke through the silence. A low, guttural sound. It wasn't the creature. It was something else. Something far worse. The voice grew louder, a low, disembodied hum vibrating through the submersible's walls. It wasn't coming from the creature outside. It was inside, within the very structure of the vessel. It was as though the ocean itself was speaking to them, urging them to understand. "What is that?" Dr. Clark gasped, unable to comprehend what was happening. The crew scrambled to their stations, their minds racing, trying to find any explanation. But the voice seemed to speak directly into their souls, bypassing their rational minds. The submersible trembled again, and this time, it was accompanied by a series of violent tremors. Something was moving through the water, something ancient, something powerful. The crew could feel the water around them shifting, as if the ocean itself was alive. The light outside pulsed, brighter now, almost blinding. They had no escape. Whatever was in these depths was beyond their understanding, and it had claimed them. The submersible shuddered again, and the strange hum grew louder, more intense, vibrating through the very bones of the vessel. The crew sat in stunned silence, unable to react, their minds unable to fully grasp the terror that had descended upon them. Captain Sullivan clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the control panel. "We can't stay here. We need to get back to the surface," he said, his voice tight with fear. But when he tried to initiate the ascent, the submersible remained dead in the water. The lights flickered once more, casting long, shifting shadows inside the cabin. Then, as if in response to their desperation, a deep, rumbling sound came from beneath them, closer now, as though something massive was stirring in the depths below. "We're not alone," Dr. Clark whispered, her voice barely audible. The cold that had filled the cabin intensified, seeping into their bones. There was something ancient and unfathomable out there, something that had watched them arrive and was now circling them like a predator. The water outside the submersible darkened, as if a shadow had passed over them. Dr. Clark's breath fogged up the porthole as she stared out into the deep, her eyes widening with dread. "It's huge," she said almost to herself. "It's bigger than anything we've ever seen." Sullivan turned to her, his voice sharp. "What are you talking about?" Dr. Clark pointed toward the porthole, her hands shaking. "That thing, it's moving, it's coming closer." The crew pressed their faces to the windows, trying to peer into the impenetrable darkness. For a moment, they saw nothing. Then, like an enormous shadow, the shape began to take form. A massive, undulating figure, too large to comprehend, moving with unnatural speed and grace. Its glowing eyes pierced through the water, locking onto the submersible. The crew gasped in terror. It was coming for them. And this time it wasn't just watching. It was hunting. "Move us, Sullivan, now!" Dr. Clark screamed, her voice breaking. But Sullivan could only stare at the controls in horror. The submersible refused to move, the engines sputtering in protest as the creature outside drew closer. The massive shape loomed ever larger, its form taking on a more detailed, monstrous appearance. Tentacles, large and writhing, emerged from the murky depths, reaching toward the submersible like dark skeletal fingers. "We're running out of time," Clark said, her voice strained. "It's getting closer. It's not going to stop until we're part of the ocean." Panic set in as the crew frantically attempted to get the submersible moving, but it was no use. The creature's presence was overpowering. It was too strong, too relentless. The crew braced for impact, knowing they were at the mercy of something that had existed long before humanity had ever touched the ocean's surface. The lights flickered one last time before plunging them into darkness again. The submersible groaned and jolted as the creature's tentacles made contact. A loud screeching sound echoed through the hull as the metal protested under the immense pressure. "We're going to break apart," Captain Sullivan shouted. Dr. Clark's heart pounded as she gripped the edge of the seat. "We need to get out of here now." But the submersible refused to move, as though the ocean itself was holding them captive. The lights flickered and then went out completely, leaving them in total darkness. A moment of chilling silence passed. Then the submersible's hull was struck again, harder this time, and a crack formed along the side. The cold water began to seep in. "We've lost integrity," Sullivan shouted, his voice raw with fear. "We need to ascend. We're running out of time." But, as he reached for the controls, the submersible's systems flickered to life for just a moment. A map appeared on the screen, showing their exact location. It was wrong. They weren't at the bottom of the trench. They were somewhere deeper, somewhere that shouldn't exist. The crew was paralyzed with terror as they realized the truth. They had ventured too deep, and now they were trapped in an abyss that defied all logic. The creature outside continued its relentless assault, its massive form looming above them. But then, something even more terrifying began to unfold. The map on the screen flickered again, and the coordinates shifted. Dr. Clark's eyes widened in disbelief. It's showing something else," she whispered. The map revealed a hidden, uncharted area at the very bottom of the ocean, a place where no human had ever been. And it was there that the creature came from. But the map also revealed something else. A warning. "The deep ones," Dr. Clark murmured, reading aloud the chilling inscription. "This is where they come from. We've entered their domain." The submersible shook again, as if acknowledging their discovery. The hum outside grew louder, vibrating through the vessel, and the crew knew that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The submersible systems flickered one last time before shutting down entirely. They were completely stranded in the depths of the ocean, trapped in an alien world that should never have been discovered. The creature outside continued to circle them, its presence overwhelming, like an ancient force that had existed long before humanity's time. The crew sat in stunned silence, each of them feeling the weight of their impending doom. Captain Sullivan looked at the monitors, his face drawn with fear. "We're not going to make it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We've come too far, and now we're going to pay the price." Dr. Clark, her hands trembling, stared at the screen showing their location, realizing that they had crossed a line, one that would have been better left uncrossed. They were not only deep within the ocean's grasp, they were in a place where no human had ever set foot before, a place where ancient forgotten things resided, things that were not meant to be disturbed. As the cold seeped deeper into their bones, and the creature outside continued its haunting approach, the crew members felt a growing sense of despair. The submersible's small cabin, once a symbol of safety, now felt like a coffin, sealed tightly in the abyss. Dr. Clark's voice broke the silence. "We have to do something. We can't just sit here and wait." Sullivan turned to her, his expression one of defeat. "What can we do? We're out of time." But then a strange sound echoed through the vessel, followed by another, and another, faint whispers, like distant voices from the deep, as though the ocean itself was alive. The crew froze, their hearts racing. "What is that?" Sullivan asked, his voice trembling. "It sounds like whispers, but there's no one down here but us." The whispers grew louder, a haunting chorus that seemed to come from every direction, pressing in on them like a suffocating force. The whispers seemed to take on form, becoming more distinct, more purposeful. "They're, speaking to us," Dr. Clark said, her voice barely audible. "They know we're here." Captain Sullivan glanced nervously at the porthole, seeing only the dark, murky waters outside. The pulsing light from the creature illuminated the surrounding depths, casting long, distorted shadows. The whispers seemed to respond to the presence of the creature, growing louder and more urgent. The crew felt the sensation of being watched, not just by the creature, but by something older, something far more ancient and terrifying. "We need to get out of here," Clark said again, her voice rising with panic. "We can't wait any longer. We don't know what they want, but I don't want to find out." But as she spoke, the temperature inside the submersible plummeted. The walls began to frost over, and an unnatural chill settled deep into their bones. The whispers grew louder. The creature was closing in. In the distance, a new light began to flicker, far brighter than the pulsing glow of the creature. It was not natural, not like the light they had seen before. This was something else, something far more powerful. "It's coming from below us," Dr. Clark said, her voice barely above a whisper. The crew turned to the screens, where a new set of readings appeared, coordinates, longitude, and latitude shifting like a map coming to life. As the numbers shifted, the submersible was drawn toward them, almost as if it was being pulled by an unseen force. "We've crossed into something," Clark said, her face pale, "something we weren't meant to find." The whispers grew louder, the light brighter, and the submersible seemed to be moving of its own accord, descending towards something that none of them could fully comprehend. The creature outside, sensing the shift, roared from the depths, its massive form slamming against the submersible's fragile walls. "We're in its territory now," Sullivan said, his voice low and filled with dread. The submersible was now descending, at an unnatural rate. The numbers on the depth gauge flashed, but the crew could hardly process them. It felt as if time itself had stretched and distorted, as though they had entered a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. Outside, the creature's shape loomed, more terrifying than ever before, its tentacles thrashing violently as if it were preparing for the final assault. But then there was a shift, a deep rumble from the very core of the earth. The crew could feel it vibrating through the submersible. Something massive was awakening beneath them. A dark chasm opened in the ocean floor, a rift that seemed to pulse with energy. "It's here," Dr. Clark gasped, her voice barely audible. "This is it. The heart of the ocean." And just as the submersible was about to enter the rift, a bright flash of light erupted from within, blinding them all. The last thing they heard was the voice, one final whisper, before everything went silent. The world outside the submersible went white with blinding light as the rift beneath them pulsed. The crew's vision was flooded, their hearts racing as they braced for whatever was coming. The submersible trembled violently, shaking them all to the core. For a moment, they thought they might lose control, but just as quickly, the light receded, and the overwhelming presence of the creature outside vanished into the depths. Silence followed, but it was a silence that was deafening, oppressive, and filled with tension. Captain Sullivan, breathing heavily, checked the control panel, but the submersible remained still, no movement, no communication from the surface. "What just happened?" Sullivan muttered, his voice barely audible. The readings on the monitors were fluctuating wildly, as if the submersible was caught in some otherworldly force. They had entered something new, something beyond the natural laws of the world. Whatever was waiting for them down there, it was far beyond human understanding. Slowly, the submersible regained its stability, but the environment outside had changed. The darkness that surrounded them was thick, almost tangible. The sea had become a suffocating, oppressive presence, as if the ocean itself were aware of their intrusion. Dr. Clark peered through the porthole, her breath catching in her throat. "This isn't just the ocean anymore," she whispered. "We've crossed into something else." Outside, the water was dark and thick, swirling with unnatural currents. Strange phosphorescent organisms floated by, casting eerie glows in the murky abyss. But it wasn't just the sea life that unnerved them. It was the sheer presence of something ancient. The crew could feel the pull of the deep, as though something vast and unknowable was observing them, waiting. Sullivan checked the depth gauge. "We're off the charts," he said, his voice flat. "We shouldn't be here. We're far past any known coordinates." The darkness outside seemed to grow even deeper, closing in on them. The silence that followed was deafening. The crew stared at the monitors, the tension in the cabin palpable. It was as though the ocean had swallowed them whole, and they were now suspended in an endless void. Then, a noise, faint at first, like a distant whisper, began to reverberate through the submersible. The sound grew louder, rising from beneath, a deep haunting rhythm that resonated through the walls. "What is that?" Dr. Clark asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's like a chant." The air inside the submersible grew colder still, the frost on the windows thickening. The hum outside intensified, and then the submersible began to drift again, as if guided by the sound. "We're being pulled," Sullivan said, his voice tense. The force that had drawn them down was now pushing them forward. The submersible glided effortlessly through the water, heading deeper into the rift, toward an unseen, unknowable destination. And with it, the crew's sense of terror grew. As the submersible moved deeper, a strange pressure began to build, pressing down on the crew like a heavy weight. Their breaths came harder, as if the very air inside the vessel had thickened. Dr. Clark felt a dizzying sensation, as though the world around her was warping. This isn't right," she gasped. The monitors were flickering, and the temperature inside the submersible dropped to an unbearable low. The water outside was completely still now, an unnatural calm settling over the scene. "We've reached something," Sullivan murmured. "But what?" He looked out the porthole, and for the first time he could see it, a massive structure looming ahead of them, its form rising out of the dark water like a forgotten monument. Its jagged edges were illuminated by a strange, otherworldly light, but the more Sullivan stared at it, the more he realized that it wasn't just a structure. It was a temple, an ancient, alien temple, forgotten by time, and now reawakening. The submersible continued its eerie journey toward the temple. The crew could feel the pull, an invisible force guiding them toward their fate. As they approached the massive structure, they could see markings on the walls, strange symbols, unlike anything they had ever seen. It's not human, Dr. Clark whispered. This isn't anything we've ever known. The temple's walls were covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of creatures unlike anything the crew had ever imagined. Creatures with elongated limbs, eyes that glowed like fire, and forms that twisted in unnatural ways. The deep, resonating hum continued, now joined by a low growl that vibrated through the submersible's hull. The crew braced themselves as the submersible was drawn closer, moving through the temple's entrance as if the structure itself was welcoming them. The doorways loomed large, ancient and impossibly grand. And when they crossed the threshold, the atmosphere inside the temple shifted. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and the air grew thick, charged with an electric energy. The submersible glided into the temple's dark, hollowed interior. The massive stone walls loomed on all sides, covered in glowing runes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. A sense of foreboding filled the cabin as the crew peered through the porthole. "This is wrong," Captain Sullivan muttered, his voice trembling. "None of this should be here." The temple was vast, stretching far beyond what the submersible could capture in one view. Massive statues stood on either side, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in expressions of ancient agony. The submersible moved deeper into the temple, guided by the same invisible force that had pulled them down here. "We need to get out," Dr. Clark whispered, her voice tight with fear. "This place, it's alive. I can feel it." The hum was louder now, resonating through the submersible's hull, as though it was speaking directly to them. Every fiber of their being screamed for escape. But they were trapped. The temple was alive, and it was watching them. The submersible came to a slow, shuddering stop at the center of the temple. The walls closed in around them, and the oppressive silence was almost deafening. Dr. Clark's hands trembled as she tried to access the control panel, but the systems were dead. The submersible was completely frozen in place, and the strange hum had now escalated to a low growl, vibrating through their bones. "We're trapped," Sullivan said, his voice hollow. "We can't move, and we can't communicate with the surface." His eyes locked onto the temple's stone walls, which seemed to be shifting, the carvings rearranging themselves before their eyes. The temple was alive. As if responding to their presence, the walls of the temple began to vibrate. A low, deep voice echoed around them, ancient and incomprehensible, reverberating through the air. "Do you hear that?" Clark asked, fear making her voice crack. The voice was calling to them, and it was not human. The sound of the voice grew louder, and the walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of it. The crew was paralyzed in fear, unable to move, unable to act. Every inch of the submersible felt heavy, as if the pressure of the ocean had increased tenfold. Then, with a deafening crack, the massive stone doors at the far end of the temple slowly began to open, revealing a dark, cavernous chamber beyond. A strange, otherworldly light emanated from within, casting long, twisted shadows. "We have to go," Dr. Clark said, her voice now frantic. "This is where it wants us to go. We have no choice." The submersible seemed to move on its own, drawn toward the open doors, as if guided by an unseen hand. The hum was deafening now, and the voices were clearer, an ancient language that filled their minds, speaking of rituals, sacrifices, and things that should never be uncovered. The submersible drifted forward, entering the chamber, and the crew knew there was no turning back. As the submersible entered the chamber, the full scale of the temple's interior was revealed. It was vast, an entire city's worth of chambers, halls, and catacombs, stretching far beyond what the crew could see. The chamber was alive with a strange pulsing light, and at the far end stood a massive altar, adorned with symbols the crew could not comprehend. The hum now turned into a chant, reverberating in their minds, forcing them to listen. They were being drawn toward the altar. "This is it," Sullivan said, his voice thick with disbelief. "This is the heart of whatever this place is." As they neared the altar, the submersible's lights flickered violently. The temperature dropped even further, and the entire chamber seemed to shift, as though the temple itself was coming alive, reacting to their presence. The whispers grew louder, and Dr. Clark felt as if her mind was about to break. "We have to stop this," she gasped. "We can't let it take us." The moment the submersible reached the altar, a violent surge of energy erupted from the temple's core. The walls trembled, the very earth beneath them shaking. The submersible was slammed against the altar, and the lights flickered out completely. Everything went black. The crew's screams were drowned out by the crashing sound of the temple's stone walls. A blinding flash of light erupted, brighter than the sun, flooding the cabin. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no sight, no sensation. Then, slowly, the darkness began to recede, and the crew found themselves somewhere else. The submersible was still intact, but they were no longer in the temple. They were in a different place entirely, the ocean around them now still and silent. The ancient force that had drawn them down was gone. But something had changed. The crew looked at each other, confused and shaken. Whatever they had encountered, whatever they had unleashed, had marked them. They had returned, but they would never be the same.